You're listening to Changing Reality. You're listening to Changing Reality. Changing Reality, where we bend reality all across the world. Only on WQHS Radio.
So hi everyone and welcome to another episode of Changing Reality. Welcome one, welcome all. We are so excited once again to have you here. For all of our returning viewers, thank you once again for joining us. And to all of our new viewers, welcome. And where have you been all this time? Don't you know that this is the place to be? But anyway, we're excited to have you today. We have an amazing guest speaker in store. But first, for any of you who are new to the show, Changing Reality is a show that features phenomenal people from all walks of life who are in essence changing their own reality. So through this show, we have the opportunity to hang out, speak to some very inspiring individuals, from social change makers, entrepreneurs, thought leaders, industry experts, to even business owners, artists, musicians, and inspiring individuals from all across the world, and many of whom have spent some time here on the Penn campus as well. So by hearing these inspiring stories of how these individuals through their lives, through their careers, are able to change the world around them, hopefully we'll be able to pick up little nuggets of wisdom that we can use in our own lives as we move forward and start answering the questions of where we want to go and what are the things that we want to do. And I wanted to do this show simply because I felt that there was such a huge power in these stories, and that there are a lot of people who do these brilliant things and make waves in the lives around the people around them that we don't know about. And hopefully, by uncovering these stories, it gives us at least a little clarity and motivation to see what we can be doing with our lives. This power of stories is something that has personally driven me. It's personally been something that I have been very passionate about and has changed my life. And I want to be able to share that with all of you, our audience, as well. So as a quick introduction, my name is Harsha, and I am your host for this segment on WQHS Radio called Changing Reality. So my journey started as an entrepreneur myself. So I actually founded and run a youth movement and social enterprise called Ascendance, which began in Malaysia, which is where I'm from, but today collaborates with not just our Malaysian Ministry of Education, but worked with over 26 countries to provide an alternative education platform for any student who wants to change their reality. So we're lucky to work with elementary to college students through various sessions, programs, experiential learning activities, and projects that help students discover what it is they're passionate about, learn about themselves and the world around them, and start their own careers while they're still in school. We've been fortunate to help work with over 50,000 students across 1,000 over communities, and have incubated countless number of student-run projects and social enterprises run by students as young as 8 to 20 years old. And the reason we've been able to do all of that has been stories. It's because of kind individuals who've taken their time out to share what worked, what didn't, what were the lessons that they learned along the way that has enabled all of this to happen. And just like that, I hope that this show, for all of you watching, is that same platform for you. So that if there are any experiences, any industries, any thoughts that you want to explore, feel free to reach out and we'll see how we can set up those stories for you to enjoy and learn from as well. So with that, it brings us to our speaker for today and our amazing story that we'll be uncovering. So our speaker today is someone who's truly a pioneer in the world of environment, investments, and energy. So he actually led and built the Global Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy Fund since its inception in 2008 all the way through to March 2020. He was actually asked to also serve at that point in time on the newly created task force to oversee the drafting and implementation of the European Investment Bank's Climate Bank roadmap, which is now enforced as of January 1st, 2021. While leading these organizations, he built a portfolio of 15 emerging market renewable energy firms, supporting over 160 projects and mobilizing over 3 billion euros in capital for these initiatives. Today, he continues his work where he is managing partner at Annycent Capital, where they continue the work of investing in climate and solutions to make this world a better place. He has many brilliant experiences. Even prior to this, he was the senior officer at the European Investment Bank's Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific Department, where he oversaw the development of private equity and microfinance portfolios. And even prior to joining them in 2003, he was the senior investment officer at the World Bank's International Finance Corporation's SME department, which he joined after 4 years at the IFC's Financial Markets Group. So lots of experiences all around the world, brilliant stories to share with us, and someone who is literally changing the world as we know it today. Without further ado, let's welcome our brilliant guest speaker onto our virtual stage. Hello, how are you doing today?
I'm fine. Thank you, Harsha, and thank you for your kind words. I feel a bit, overwhelmed.
Really? I think, of all people, I should be overwhelmed. Every show before we have the show, we prepare and I try to read up as much as I can. And as I was telling you before, I don't think 45 minutes is enough to talk about all the amazing impact that you've created. And hopefully some of the stories that have led you to be able to do that. I think you live the dream life of many Penn students. You are in finance, you are literally, investing in some of the best and brightest ideas to save our planet. And you have had a career that spans all across the world. So I think not just me, but everyone watching is very, very jealous. And we can only hope to achieve, half of the success that you have had.
Thank you. But, thinking about that, when I was at Wharton, I really had no idea about what I would be doing after graduating from the school. And it was both a bunch of circumstances, but also I think I always wanted to do something which rhyme or jam with discovery. I just you mentioned I've traveled the world a lot. I remember when I was a young teenager, even before, I thought I just want to see the world. And lucky enough, I managed to have my career help me fulfill this dream. But also you reflect back, the world is so big, I still feel I've seen so little of it. But at least I've got a sense of it. I hope so.
No, and still a long way to go and a lot of things to do to save the world, right? So I'm sure your jet-setting lifestyle will continue. But, going back to teenage you, when you were looking at how you wanted your career to unfold, how you wanted your life to unfold, what do you want to do when you were, a teenager, just in that age of deciding what university we want to do, in that, pivotal moment where we think, we have to make all the plans for the rest of our lives? How did you kind of go about thinking? What were the things you wanted to explore and try out? I know, on paper, you've done the diploma in political science, you went on to study law, but, what was your mindset like at that point in time?
I did not know, to be honest. As a child, as a boy, maybe still as a young teenager, my dream was to become an astronaut. Perhaps it was, again, this idea of travel, of being in totally unique, circumstances, to navigate around the globe, and mind you, not even, maybe a walk on the moon. But, at the time, it was another era. Besides the Soviet Union and the US, there were no other space power. And I knew as a European, as a French citizen, I had no chance. Plus, to be honest, and that came back to haunt me when I went to Wharton, math was not my strong point. So all the choice I've made in terms of studies was what was I interested in. So political science in France, it's a fairly demanding field. I know in the US it's seen more like a broad generalist field. In France, it's highly selective. To go to study political science, you have to pass a competitive exam, and me admitted to it. So I'm not saying that to say that I'm smarter than the average, but I kind of like this competitiveness in it and the field itself. Then political science led to law, and again, I had no idea whether I wanted to become a lawyer. Clearly, the idea of helping people divorce was not very attractive to me. I never had any experience about corporate law or as a context. I've come from a large family, and my brothers and my sister, some of us are the first one to graduate from high school. So there was not, within my direct, surrounding people who said, "Oh, I like to do that." In a way, it was gave me a lot of freedom. Sometimes a bit of solitude, but a lot of freedom. I could just go and discover what I wanted to do. And when I went to study law, I found it to be one of the intellectually the most stimulating field I've encountered. I still like it a lot. You still could catch me reading, some scholarly legal book, because law is all about reasoning. It's all about logic. It's all about values. There's a lot of history in it, which is all type of issues I like to dwell with. And then I went to Wharton. Now there is a little angle to it, because I had met when I was 18 a young American lady who today is my wife 40 years later. And I realized that if we wanted to settle in the US, which was an option at the time, my European degrees in the 90s, were not really bringing me a lot of equity or currency on the US job market. So I started to scope around what could I do. It's kind of a long story, but that led me to Wharton. I had no idea about business schools, a few years before. I even thought it was bizarre. Why do you need to learn business? There's something that should be natural. Little did I know. And again, when I was at Wharton, I found it fascinating. It was extremely difficult on me. I was not on the dean's list. I'm saying that to any of those who are still at school. I feel bad about it.
You can relax now. Okay, no, don't have to be on the dean's list.
One of the things I was always doing, I chose all the courses I had no idea what it was about. So I took a lot of finance class because I knew nothing about finance. It's like if I go to a restaurant, I always choose the dish. I have no idea what it is because I just like to discover. Definitely not something I can fix at home. So I took a lot of finance class, statistics, and I always said statistics has been one of the most rewarding class because it made me number literate. I was illiterate. Etc. Then, while I was in school, the Berlin Wall fell. So again, for perhaps harsher not to be condescending, for your generation might not mean much. It was life-changing for the Western world, at least, if not for the whole world, because that was the end of the Soviet Union. And as a European, you have to imagine, as a Western European, we had something like a huge North Korea at our doorstep, which we just spent our whole life ignoring because we could never go there. And the people living there, very, very few of them could cross the border and come and see us. So at the end of the day, we all went our merry life just ignoring each other. And suddenly, it all opened up. And that changed, that gave me at least a professional direction in my life, because I thought, I want to do something there, whatever it is. I want to go and do something there. And as I ended up spending 6 years in Russia, for the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development.
Okay, I want to get to that story definitely, and I love that you've had such an interesting I think sometimes we take for granted reading history, what it really meant in that moment. So thank you for sharing that. As a huge fan of history, I can only imagine how that completely changed the landscape of your experiences. How did you decide? And I love how you say, statistics made you number literate. As a number illiterate person learning the language, I completely understand that. What made you go more into business after that? I know you had some very interesting experiences after you were in Penn and Wharton as well. You spent some time at even the Walt Disney Company. So how did you decide, what was the way that business would take you afterwards?
Well, it's all happenstance and chance. I mean, clearly, when I graduated from Wharton, the job market was terrible. And I was kind of casting around. At Wharton, I really discovered two things. What I mentioned, not discovered, but witnessed, the change in Eastern Europe. Then I discovered an organization I had never heard of, which is full of Wharton grads, the International Finance Corporation, the World Bank arm, the World Bank private sector arm. And because, were like people coming from the World Bank giving lectures or even interviewing. I say, wow, this is what I want to do. And so that gave me a direction. I always recommend anybody asking me what to do, say, what is the direction you want to go, and go towards that direction. It may not be a straight line, but where's your North Star? Just go for it. Keep going for it. So I I really discovered that toward the end of my Wharton years. In fact, there was a big movement of Wharton grads going to Eastern Europe to do technical assistance with Wharton professors. I ended up going to Lithuania with a small group of Wharton grads and a the late Professor Mendelsohn, who was a specialist of stock exchange. So I didn't teach anything about stock exchange. I gave a class on corporate finance. Somebody gave a class in organization science, and somebody in marketing. So we had like a mini MBA in 6 weeks in Lithuania, and it just reinforced my view that was where I wanted to go. Now it took me to spend a year at Disney, because Disney had made me an offer. And I needed to pay my bills. I had borrowed money to go to Wharton. So I went to Disney, which I knew was not really my long-term goal, but I found it fascinating because I was in the middle of a very big US corporate, at a time of crisis. And today I could easily write a long series scenario about, life within Disney. Between from the smiley Mickey Mouse in the park to the ruthlessness of the environment behind it. I learned tons of things. Again, I was thrown into the fire because the place was Disney is a big success in terms of a product. It's one of the leading touristic attraction in Europe in the world, and I'm talking about Euro Disney. But the operation side and the financial side are extremely challenging for all types of reasons. No time here to go, and I could write a few business case about it.
We'll do a Disney Plus series just on that.
Exactly. But that really you learn more from crisis than anything else. This is what at least I discovered for myself. And while I was at Disney, I was approached by a team putting together a company putting together a team to go to a small town in Russia to set up what might have been the first private equity fund ever set up in Russia. And I went there. It's a town called Smolensk, 450 kilometers west of Moscow. And this is where I landed one day, not speaking Russian, in the middle of the post-Soviet crisis, where it was a bizarre world. But again, fascinating. You either loved it or hated it because it was unbearable. But if you could bear it, it was fascinating.
I can't imagine going to a place where, you don't speak the language. You don't like I've been fortunate wherever I go, at least, somebody speaks English there all the time. But you weren't just going to a place where, there was a language difference. You were going to a place with quite literally one of the biggest cultural differences, one biggest, economic differences, different. So in anything and everything, at one of its most, I wouldn't even probably post explosive times, if I may use the term. But you were going in a time where there was a lot of recovery, there was a lot of things happening, a lot of movement in their economy, and also the world as large, as they kind of participated and learned to work together. Tell us a little bit about your experiences then, in a sense. This is something we read about, but how was it different being on the ground and setting up financial institutions in a place like that, in that kind of global political climate, with the political science degree, of course? I'm sure that came in helpful. But
I keep repeating, every challenge is a learning experience, and there, I would wake up every morning having no clue how the day would end. That was the daily norm. And one of the challenges, it was a very unique time because the Soviet Union had disintegrated, both politically, administratively, everything was a shambles. Now, nowadays, Russia is what it is, but there's something back. At the time, there were, guideposts, that people used in Russia were gone. The Communist Party, which had regulated the whole society for 70 years was gone. The government, the federal government in Russia was extremely weak. I'll just give you an example. I found a Russian friend with whom we wanted to play tennis. There was only one tennis court in Smolensk. It was in the middle of a military base. And believe it or not, we just walked in with our tennis practice. And, you would not imagine that possible today. And at the same time, all the folks in the West with whom I had to deal could not understand what we were facing. They could not understand that, to even send a fax, that was before the internet, from Smolensk to London, which was, our headquarters, was a whole adventure. They could not understand. For example, one day I was trying to send a fax to the economic advisor of President Yeltsin in the Kremlin. And at the time, they were in such disarray in the Kremlin that they did not have fax paper. So I took a box of fax paper that we had brought from the West, gave it to one of the drivers we had, and say, now you drive 4 hours to Moscow and hand this fax paper to this guy so I can send him faxes. That's just one out of thousands of examples of the situation we're facing, all the time. So now this time is gone. Nothing is static, but that was the challenge. And also another thing that did not exist at the time, the whole language of finance did not exist in Russian. That is to say, difference between income, profit, marginal income, those were totally not even foreign concepts, abstract. They could not understand what it meant, because this is very interesting, because the language shapes your mind. We're all shaped by the language we speak. And because 99% of the former Soviet population had not been confronted with the concept of profit the way we understand it, net income, cash flow, it was very, very difficult at the beginning, at the beginning to explain it. So I worked, with a guy I'd hired who was became my first interpreter, who ended up getting an MBA for Northwestern. So hopefully his interpreting taught him a few things, helped him. But we were spending a lot of time just explaining basic concepts. And now, if you go to Russia nowadays, because whatever are the issues with Russia, one thing is the population on average is highly educated. So no, they've caught up totally. It took roughly 5 years. But even when I explained that to some of my Russian contacts, they kind of look at me and say, "You're crazy. It couldn't be." I said, "No, remember, I have the proof." But anyway,
Texas, yeah.
And so the idea when I went to, it was a very naive idea at the time. It says, the concept was, if we create, private equity funds, which was why not, and invest in former military companies to turn them into civilian, companies, yeah, it's a good idea on paper, totally unrealistic otherwise. And this is something I've discovered many, many times. We project our own fantasies, into context that defeat them. I've seen them when I was doing microfinance too. We have some fantasies, then reality. I always say reality or the laws of gravity always tend to apply at the end. You cannot defy them forever.
Oh, I have a question on that. Many times, I come from a part of, like Southeast Asia, where it's very different from the US in a way. And things that are done here are very different from, the way things are done in, I would say for any part of the world, it's different from each other. But at the same time, I find that I have a personal challenge in articulating that difference of why certain things work in a way here and don't when I speak to people in different parts of the world. So people would often say, why don't you do this, this, and this, and this? And then, the startup will grow, the business will grow, this will happen. And I don't know how to tell them, but it won't work here in this context. That doesn't make sense in the ground. I mean, it makes sense in the context that you're saying it, but in actual application, that's very tough. How did you start having those conversations? I'm sure you've had many conversations.
Yeah.
over the years. So how do
Here's-
you?
yeah, let me start with the end of your remark. You say when you say it won't work, perhaps it could work, but it's not going. You cannot, implement it or bring it forward the way you would do it, in the U.S. or in Europe. The point, I think, Harsh. I mean, you and I, and we don't have to feel guilty about it. We just have to be aware of it. We're part of a small group, which is very international because we're born and raised in one part of the world. Then we moved around to educate ourselves somewhere else, and we have, through work, we've also been exposed and even grown some roots in third places. It's We're a little bit, like third kind citizens of the world. And we must keep in mind that often we deal with people, and it has nothing to do with the value of quality. We're no better than they are, but their reality is different. And to really understand what is the reality of the people we're dealing with or we're trying to work with, is fundamental to getting anything done. And this is something that I think is often overlooked. We're not paying enough attention. And I'm not arguing. I'm not saying it's just from a political correctness of looking at the local values, but it's looking at what are the challenges. What do people need to do when they get up in the morning? What is their first priority? Look, let me give you an example. When I started working on renewable, a friend of mine, a guy who became a friend of mine, was a pioneer in very small solar lights, because he's a brilliant Australian engineer, and he created a company called Barefoot Power. And what he saw is in the poor world, a lot of people have those little kerosene lights. So kerosene lights, the capital cost of kerosene light is negligible, because often it's a tin of some other tin that's been reconverted into a small light. Kerosene is very expensive. It's very unhealthy. It's very dangerous. However, it has an incredible quality. It can be bought in very small quantity, which matches the cash flow pattern of very poor people, who, when they have a few, whatever is their currency, can go, their neighborhood, buy a little bit of kerosene and use it. And if for the rest of the week, they no longer have money, well, they won't have it. But that's it. When you bring to them, a $10 small solar light, very efficient, it's very hard for them to make the decision to buy. It's not because they're stupid. On the contrary, they're very smart. They realize this light could be like 2 weeks of their income. If it's a dud, they're in a hole. So how do you, convince them or reassure them that this light, which is going to save them a lot of money, because once they have it, they no longer have to buy kerosene for 3 years. It's a huge cash flow saving. It's highly profitable. However, to convince them to buy the light proved to be very, very difficult. Now, we have overcome that, so this is another story. But I think I'm telling that story just to say, something that seems so obvious to us. If you put a bunch of Wharton students in a room, they'll say, "Oh yeah, this, so all the benefits, they're all there. They're just missing one thing. The people who they want to sell it to, have a very soundly grounded risk aversion, because if it's a binary situation. If they miss it, they're in a hole."
Someone once told me, entrepreneurship or business as a whole is half the finance and half the psychology and half the feeling, the emotion, the people element of it, really.
I would say 2/3 psychology and 1/3 finance and innovation. It's and a bit of luck. A lot of
That's a 90% would be the luck. But no, very, very interesting in a sense. You later went to, the IFC, and you started not just working in Russia, but also going to, sub-Saharan Africa. You started going to, different parts of the world. As you started going to, all these different parts of the world, we sitting in, a room, in a classroom in a place like Wharton, or, in a nice room here in Malaysia, where I am right now for the summer, it's hard for us to imagine how things are like in the ground there. For you, in a sense, what was the thing that you think, you learned the most about people and this whole psychology of how people think that you picked up as you started traveling to these places?
Well, that's a very interesting and a very loaded question. First, if you mention Africa, I always want to remind everyone, same thing as when we talk about developing countries. Developing countries, 150 countries. So we're putting under one label countries which are fundamentally extremely different. You know, Nigeria, 110 million people, and Fiji, which is a small island, in the island state or archipelago in the middle of the Pacific. What do they have in common? Maybe a few stats, but again, sharing statistics doesn't mean you share the same life, the same issue. I don't think so. So when I started traveling in Africa and other regions of the world, but Africa especially, first realized the great diversity of Africa. For Europeans, we tend, because we colonized most of Africa. I mean, mostly France and Great Britain, but also Portugal, a little bit of Spain. That Africa is just one thing. No, it's a very diverse. It's a very diverse continent. It's huge. That's the other thing. It's huge, huge, huge. And with very diverse society. And this is what I find interesting. I know there is a whole debate in the US about colonialism, etc. But the fact is today, for example, French colonialism has left a deep footprint in the culture of the countries which France colonized, and you see huge differences with the British society. So let me start on the French way. You eat much better in West Africa when it was colonized by French people, and it's what I find fascinating. Even local food, local African cuisine, in Francophone Africa is really interesting. In Anglophone Africa, it's boring. Okay, now beyond food, let's move beyond food. Generally, I'm an enemy of generalization, but once in a while you need to use them. Generally speaking, Anglophone Africa has more entrepreneurship and more commercial sense, because this is really what the part of the British culture. French African countries have stronger administration, because France really, has a deep culture, centuries old culture of developing public administration, and that is today a context you need to bear in mind when you operate them. I also always advise nothing is static. When I started working in Africa in the late 90s with the IFC, the African cadre I was working with were at least my age, if not older. Were teenagers, often during the decolonization era. So their relationship with, to put on the label of the West, was very different than the relationship that you see today with young African executives who are much more like world citizens. In the beginning of my work in Africa, in Francophone Africa, mostly France was their main reference. Now, if I go to Senegal, Ivory Coast, it's going to be even more the US or Canada, or even that China. The number of Africans traveling or even studying in China is incredible, and misunderstood or misperceived. So Africa is just, I've seen this evolution, and now when I deal, with this newer generation of African executives, it's a totally different approach and mental framework, than the one I was working with. I wouldn't say confronted with, but working with 20, 25 years ago. I'm not saying whether it's right or wrong, whether it's good or bad. It's not I'm against value judgment, but it's a separate thing. It's a reality, Always start with the reality, because otherwise reality comes back and bite you.
How do you, in such context, it's very easy for us to think we know things. You've worked with a group of people, you understand them, you work well with them. And then it's easy to think the next group of people from the same region will have the same working styles or habit patterns or ways of looking at the world, in a sense. How do you remain kind of or your advice to us in a sense of how can we remain kind of, a bit less static in our own minds?
Yeah.
and be
Again,
adaptable.
excellent question, Harsha. Excellent question. I think you have to. This is at least what I'm doing for myself. We shouldn't have false modesty about our own experience and knowledge, but we should have the lucidity and humility to say, does that experience and knowledge apply here? Or how can it apply? Is it always going to apply the same way? Let me give you an example, if I may. When I was doing microfinance, now we call that inclusive finance. Okay, microfinance, to summarize, when it started to really be noticed, at the same time, there was a very large consulting firm where, many Wharton students like to go to, called, let's name them McKinsey, would say, advise all the banks, close down all the small accounts you have. They are just, more costly than anything. Just focus on your core business and your core clients, and you'll be happy. Okay, but basically that leaves out in the developed world or in the developing world all of the low-income people out. But that is even beyond that. Then we realized there was all this massive population. If you don't have, bank accounts, financial services, it's not that you're stuck, but it doesn't help in your life because you basically, for example, keep cash at home, which is unsafe, and the cash is not productive for oneself or for the community. So microfinance was the realization that we could develop business models to serve the unbanked, the millions, if not the billions of people who were unbanked, and that would have great social benefits. So now context again, by trying to answer your question. In some societies, group lending, that is to say there is group solidarity in a loan, works very well. And because of our Western mind, and Harsha, I know you were kind of both educated in the West, but also from Asia. But let's say in the European or U.S. mind, to simplify it a bit, we kind of like this idea of group solidarity. Always sounds fuzzy. People singing kumbaya around the campfire, etc. So a lot of proponents of microfinance say, we need to do all those group lending everywhere, and it went down crashing. Why? Because it does not always work this way. In some society, it's just individual responsibility. It's true in some rural areas, there's a lot because people live in families and groups, etc. It made sense. But I can tell you in urban area, which is where most of the population was, it did not make any freaking sense. So when we impose group, borrowing, well, what happened? People just did form group of people they have very little, solidarity with, because that was what we asked them to do. And they borrowed money, and of course, they defaulted because there was no group solidarity. So again, I'm giving you this example. Say we came out with something we found that was generous, nice and sensible. It was totally idiotic, to put it mildly. So again, reality, context, matters. And once you have that, it's it's not that there are infinite variations. There, of course, there are infinite variations, but you can say it's, statistics again. That's why I love statistics. The 80-20, you do find that things tend to congregate around the means, and then you start developing your business model around that.
Very, very, very nicely said. Very good example. And I can understand where that logic comes from. So very, very good warning to all of us to not, take what we think we know for granted too much. But I appreciate you sharing that. You also are now, in this whole world of financing the climate solutions and, the energy solutions that will hopefully save us all from the current crises that we can now physically see and feel. Why do you go into this kind of portion of the world of finance? What brought you to that world in a sense? You could have just done the microfinance and the regular private equity and been happy with life, but you chose to venture this whole thing, which I am very grateful for as a Gen Z. But why?
I've been asking myself the same question for a long time. So I think that maybe two key reasons, two sides of the same coin. One, occupied by the shrink I do not have, is maybe, when I went to Wharton, I felt like I had the total imposter syndrome. I think, I knew nothing. I mean, the people I was surrounded with that, worked at Goldman Sachs, they were totally fluent in things I could barely understand. And so, I kind of have a survival instinct. I realize if I compete head to head with those guys, I'm not sure I'll come out, on top. And in fact, many of the interviews show that. I'll be very transparent. I was rejected by all but, in fact, Goldman Sachs, but they wanted me to be a trader. I thought, what? That's what it sounds like fun for a few weeks, a few months, but I couldn't see my life, there. Anyway, so I went, and I've always, I've often done that. I started to develop an instinct to go where fewer people were going. So yeah, maybe because, maybe it's less competitive. I have more freedom. It's more freedom I discovered. If you go in a crowded field, it's basically you imitate what has already been done. It's very difficult to innovate. And I truly, I've always been inclined toward blank pages. When you just have to build things from scratch. And that was really the issue in Russia. When I went to Russia, there was no model that existed. Nobody knew. Nobody had been confronted to situations such as the early post-Soviet Union. And although, sometimes there were some people barking, on my back, oh, do this and do that. I say, yeah. It's like, I was being asked to present an investment to the investment committee of EBRD. Well, we need, 5 years of audited statements of the company, sir. I say, well, 2 years ago, they did not have any audited statements at all. And right now, they don't have it really audited, but they're trying to, see what goes on the right side and what goes on the left side. And finally, beyond that, even if you had that, it meant nothing. If you could not make a sound business decision on, what a Soviet company was like from a balance sheet or P&L standpoint. And again, they didn't have P&Ls anyway. So it was difficult because unless you really understood the reality, people don't say, but why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? On the other hand, I loved it because, we just have to just find out, what to do. And this is, in microfinance, that was often, progressively I've gone to more and more, pioneering new stuff. I got convinced that we could use market mechanism to address social issues. Not every social issue can be addressed with market mechanism. And what I call market mechanism means investing for profit. Not everyone, but many can. Access to finance absolutely can. Access to power, yes, also. Although there are some frontier parts of the market which are still challenging, but I trust some smart guys and ladies will come up with business models that will work. And it's happening. And look, I knew absolutely nothing about energy when I started, but I knew about market development. I knew about, if you want to develop something in a country, in a region where there is nothing, I've been there before. So I knew that to start human capital, you need to find the group, the teams, the individuals with whom you can work. And those groups have to be local. And when I say local, they do not necessarily need to have been born and raised there, but they need to have people who are willing to be there and develop roots. You do not do a lot of investments by flying in and out. It does not work, and so building local teams with local roots, was key. Then I always say renewable, it's not rocket science. The technologies, although they're evolving, but the technologies have been there, from hydro to wind to solar, to biomass. It's not. I always say I don't invest in clean tech. Clean tech is great, but it's new stuff. We are just using very well established, technology and solutions in different parts of the world, but it's a lot of work. I'm not going to say it's easy. It's like a knife and soft butter, but it's possible. It's absolutely possible. The proof, we have done 170, 180 projects. And you mentioned some of the statistics. In 10 years, I was facing massive skepticism.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah.
But here we go again. to me, it's the same story as microfinance. It's the idea that very low income people in a household could not be banked was wrong. They can be banked. You just have to have the right product, the right business model. For example, and technology then came in to help. But banks in most countries of the world tend to be very nice places, glass buildings, etc. Yes, the reality, poor people will feel intimidated that they don't belong there. They're not dressed properly to walk in. They're going to be looked down at. I always have memories, for example, in Latin America, seeing, the branches of, most microfinance organizations being in popular neighborhood, all doors open, people just walking in, just sitting in the middle, and all the officers are lining the wall, and dealing with clients. Or the officers would go where the people had their trade and deal with them there. And that broke the barrier. And the officer were not like smartly dressed with fancy shoes and wearing more money that the client would earn in a year. And it worked.
Very, very, very interesting perspective. And building on the work that you've done now with all of this climate, really setting the stage. It is like, today I think it's so easy for us to take for granted all the infrastructure that people like you have set up to make climate investing, or to make people interested in entrepreneurship in climate have a fighting chance of actually going out there, building the ideas, scaling, and so on. What do you think were the biggest challenges that you had to kind of look through leading up to here, and what do you think is the current challenge that the climate entrepreneurs and the climate pioneers of today need to face? Well, what's their challenge to go through now?
The past challenges still remain the same. There's a culture of conformism everywhere. This is one of the strengths of the U.S. The U.S. is both a very conservative society, as you and I know, but also a society which, is very open to innovation. And there are like hundreds of, we don't hear about the innovators who did not succeed. I wouldn't say they failed. They just did not succeed. We all know the big names, and some of them, even attended Wharton. But this kind of ecosystem, I know I don't want to sound too biological, but it's if you want a child, you need one female egg, just one. Ladies are much more efficient than men, and millions, of sperm to achieve to have a beautiful child. I think entrepreneurship is the same. You need thousands of people trying, and a few will break it, and they will make the whole difference. And that's the one we see. But what I've always found, even with the IFC and EIB, is a form of institutional laziness. It's always easier to repeat what has been done before than to try to do something new. And I was lucky that I always found like cracks in the wall where I managed to go through. And it's I was aware of it, so I was really trying to always navigate the politics and to make it acceptable, and so that has not changed today, especially in climate. I think that it's a very big problem, and it's one where, although I keep saying I'll die optimistic, but where I'm very concerned. The lack of enough more capital could be invested today in climate solution, which make business sense. That's to say, not grants, investments. The big pockets of capital, which are now more evenly distributed, between the West and the East, even in Africa, are not supporting, are not investing fast enough and big enough for misperception of risk. In fact, just literally yesterday at Harsha, I just got feedback from one of the largest pension funds in the UK, saying, that for my new renewable platform, that because, we could not really be rated A1, they could not invest. And I'm like, Have you been? I know the guy saying that he's just following these, prudential, regulation books. But that's the problem. The world is burning. We're doing something right now. I'm sometimes turned on by investors say, "Oh, I could make a higher spread refinancing mortgages in Santa Monica." I'm just like, sure you can. Go and explain that to your kids, by the way, in the evening. And when the whole California is burning, what are you going to do with your mortgages that you're holding on your books? There's a cognitive disconnect right now in capital markets. I'm very disciplined that renewable is a for-profit business. There is no reason, there's no reason to give power for free. And even, some people argue, very poor people, very poor people have access to energy, but that access is extremely expensive, and the energy service they get or the product they get is lousy. My business is to improve their access by offering them a better product at a lower price. And let me go back to microfinance, if I may, for a second, because that is exactly the same paradigm. Some people say, oh, we invented microfinance. No, BS. Microfinance has existed for centuries. It's called the market money lender. It is the guy who lends to a woman who has no other capacity a few dollars that she's going to then take those dollars, walk for a day to the countryside, buy vegetables and fruit and vegetables, walk back and sell them in town for a margin, then pay back a loan at to the market money lender with who charges 25% per week of interest rate. Our business in microfinance was to make a whole credit access transparent and maybe to charge 20% per year. So some people in the West say, oh, this is too expensive for them. Say, you don't know what you're talking about. And nobody's forcing us. Nobody's forcing our borrowers to come. They just see value in what we do. So same thing, going back to renewable, because there is always some misunderstanding sometimes. Renewable is power. It's just very economic power. Nowadays, with the improvement of technologies and the economic virtue of renewable is significant. Now people are going to say, oh, it's intermittent. I can tell you, in most developing countries, people know about intermittency is called brownout or blackout. So, it's, and you can balance grids. When the more intermittent, solutions you put online, the more opportunity you have to balance the grid. And it's, it is a for-profit business. In the long run, it's never going to be a high margin business because it shouldn't be. It's a low risk business. Low risk and high margin in the long run does not exist. There's a trick. Those arbitrage cannot last forever. But right now it's still fairly high margin. Why? Simply because demand is very high in all of the countries where I operate, and supply is always trying to catch up. And renewable technology, on top of the environmental benefit, which need not be explained, are extremely competitive. I always say, think back about what happened with COVID and the war in Ukraine. For the countries which have to import their source of energy, fuel, whatever it is, they're totally exposed to dollar, variations compared to their national currency, disruption in logistics, etc. I don't see how you can do an embargo on wind, irrigation, or on the river, that's propels your hydro turbines.
When you put it that way, it's a much safer bet when you think about it. Then.
Yeah, and the other thing I know for sure, whereby neither you or I can know the price of oil or coal just tomorrow for sure. I know exactly the price of wind and solar radiation tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, in the next 5 centuries. It's zero.
I think in many ways we've been kind of tricked in our minds to accept systems that I wouldn't say don't, like, they definitely work, but they're not as efficient as we think they are. We're just used to them in a sense.
We're humans. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not, I don't believe there are dark plots. We're just humans. We need our fragility is we're smart, but we may not be exactly as smart as we want to believe we are. And most of our thinking, and I'm the same, is repetitive. I'm sure in many things because I'm not confined to it. I'm just go with the flow. But again, as I was confronted to some issues in my work, I say, okay, are we going to keep repeating the same thing that doesn't work? And nobody really cares because, oh, well, this is what we do. It doesn't work, but this is what we do. I'll say, okay, let's think a minute. Uh, it's and the case for renewable is there. It's when I started GRF, you mentioned it. This group I started in 2008. There was a huge amount of skepticism that about the value of the technologies and whether we could build those plants, etc. Simply because it had not been done. But I keep saying, who has tried? And the answer was nobody had tried. I said, okay, at least let's try it. We cannot find out if it doesn't work before we try it.
Very, very nice. Very nice way of saying. As we kind of wrap up this conversation, and as I said, definitely not enough time to get into it. I have so many more questions that I'd love to talk to you about, but maybe a part 2 another day, once we've saved the world and, reduced the
Exactly.
But, as we wrap up, I think a lot of, young entrepreneurs now are very, very passionate about tackling these issues. And, I don't even have to think. We actually sent out like several surveys and studies and, collecting information in the last couple of months of what entrepreneurs in our networks wanted to learn about, and climate, energy always came up on top in a sense, what they could be doing better as entrepreneurs to come up with ideas that solve these issues. At times, we are very optimistic. Obviously, that's why we're entrepreneurs. I think you need a healthy dose of optimism as any entrepreneur. But at times, it can be a little bit demotivating when you hear about all of these different, certain setbacks, or even by just seeing, how little people still believe in these ideas at times, in a sense. Though we're much better off than before, it still gets to, I think, a lot of entrepreneurs at times. What is your advice, for all of us who want to change the world, who essentially want to live a life like you, exciting, jet setting, but creating real impact in a sense, to keep going towards our North Star without getting demotivated by all the noise around?
Look, it's, as you say, to be an entrepreneur, you need to have passion. You need to have something burning in you. You talk about, flashy lifestyle. I would caution you against that. It's a labor-intensive lifestyle. Many of my trips, I had people, some of them wanted to tag along because they thought it was exciting. Most of them, after 3 days, were in the hospital because their stomach couldn't take it, or after 15 hours in bumpy roads by 45 degrees Celsius without air conditioning in the car. And it didn't look anymore like Club Med to them. But I still found it, I would have done nothing else because I found it extremely interesting. I found it extremely interesting to go in some remote places. So to your question, you need to have passion. You need, to find nourishment in what you do, but you also need to behave, or they have the mentality of an, if I may say, a monk or a nun. That is to say, it's slow working, it's persistence, it's humility. There's rarely a big bang, for it, or sometimes when the story is told, to make it flashier, it is described as a big bang. Most entrepreneurs, have many nights they cannot sleep because they don't know whether they'll have enough cash, for the next month. I watch, I'm sure many of you guys watch the Silicon Valley, and not only was it very entertaining, what I found they really got right is when I forgot his name, the main entrepreneur, who was like throwing up, who was like have anxiety fits. That is what it is. It's not like all rosy and dandy. If it were so easy, everybody would be an entrepreneur. You know, but you have to have it in you. You have to have say, there's nothing else I'd like to do right now, but just follow my idea because I think it can work or it's beautiful, whatever it is. There is something artistic in being an entrepreneur. If you're an artist and you dedicate your life to your art, you cannot do it thinking, I'm going to be very wealthy. Because you have no idea whether you may be wealthy despite of the quality or the lack of quality of your art. We all know the story of Van Gogh, who has one of the priciest, paintings in the world. But who could not sell, a painting in his lifetime. So it's, this is what, I said, be aware of that, and it's okay. We have a chance for us. To significant extent, we can choose our path in life. Not entirely because we cannot disconnect ourselves from, again, context where we are, etc. But compared to many other, people, we have a real, that I would call privilege, and we need to use it to the best.
Very, very well said. Very nice ending to our session today. I work with a lot of young people, and when they say they want to be entrepreneurs, I ask why, and they say, because I don't want to work a 9-to-5 job. And I say, oh, well, an entrepreneur's life is a 24-hour job. You never get off the clock, in a sense.
Yeah.
And I think they'd be very inspired to hear this, and also slightly terrified. But I like that ending. Go with all the passion of an entrepreneur. Go with all of that. But you have to have the sense and tranquility and patience of a monk or a nun looking to make literal miracles happen. But thank you so much. I really appreciate you being on the show. This is a very, very fun conversation, and I truly appreciate all of the wisdom that you've shared with me and our audience today.
Thank you, Harsha. My pleasure.
Okay. And to our audience, thank you always for joining us and listening in as well. This has been Changing Reality. Catch you guys again next week. Bye.
You're listening to Changing Reality. Changing Reality, where we bend reality all across the world. Only on WQHS Radio.